It's funny, but at this COP and all the others, it's like the P word, as I call it, has been banned. And by that, I mean population. And you felt the sort of relief in the room that we could talk about this. And of course, this was people in the front line. And the Minister for the Environment from Malawi, Nancy Tembo, said, we have to talk about population, because without it, we will not be able to enable our children to live that wonderful future that should be available to everybody, and we will not protect our environment, and our ecosystems will collapse.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Climate Emergency Forum. My name is Regina, and I'll be your host today as we discuss matters of population. We have a special guest today, and that is Robert Maynard of Population Matters. Robert Maynard was a former producer and presenter of BBC Radio 4's Farming Today. He was also commissioned by the BBC to undertake several investigative trips for costing the earth. These included visiting Bhopal, India, and that was 10 years after the catastrophic explosion there at the Union Carbide pesticide factory. Many of you may remember that, and we'll put a link for more information regarding that catastrophic environmental event. So if you haven't heard about it, you can learn about it. He's also director of community programs at Avon Wildlife Trust, and he's a current trustee of the Countryside Restoration Trust, and he has served in the same capacity previously for the Environmental Investigation Agency and Population Matters. And of course, this couldn't be a more pressing topic. I read today in the New York Times that India is either on track or has today surpassed the population of that of China, which is incredible, because if you look at the landmass of India and the landmass of China, what a vast difference. And if any of you have ever been to India, you know how dire the situation is. I have to tell you, the first time I was in India was astounding, because I was in a traffic jam, but it was a human traffic jam. There were no cars. It was literally just humans. And it was everywhere, but it was like in this particular event, we were on a road and we couldn't move, and everyone just had to go slow and take their time and be patient. Thank goodness no one lost their temper. And finally, we were able to angle our way down the street. But it really brought to mind for me the dire situation that humanity is in. And in fact, I really was able to see a lot of environmental devastation in India. And I dare say it wasn't just because of climate change, but I think also because of just so many humans. So many humans. We've had this analogy before, but imagine you're hosting a dinner party and you have enough food for 10 guests and 20 show up. Either some people are not going to get any food. Maybe some people are more aggressive. They're going to get more food. Some people go away hungry. Some people go away angry. Add to the number of people who show up to 50 and you've prepared food for 10. It's going to be a disaster. So in the case of India, perhaps we have enough food. This is not to scale, it's an example, but enough food for 10 people and 100 show up. These are real world situations that we're talking about here, and it's very serious. One of the most important things, according to the book Drawdown by Paul Hawken, that we can do is limit the number of babies that we have. Women who are more educated, more empowered, and granted a greater degree of autonomy or a greater degree of what they can do with their bodies tend to have less children. And this is highly beneficial for the country and for their GDP. It also is highly correlated with happiness and life satisfaction. So I'm truly, truly interested to hear what Robin has to say. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Robin, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Regina, and thank you very much for inviting me to this broadcast of the Climate Emergency Forum. So yes, I work for an organization called Population Matters, which sort of tells you what we're concerned about, but it's not the only thing we're concerned about. So yes, of course, it's the population of us humans, but it's also the populations of stuff that we consume, the resources we take, and that we throw out as waste, as trash, into and onto the environment. And it's the populations of the other species with whom we share this one habitable planet. I mean, we've just launched a rocket in Europe going off to Jupiter to look at the moons to see if underneath the ice on the moons there is water, which might enable life. But that seems a pretty far off prospect in terms of where we are now, this one beautiful blue-green pearl hanging in space, the only known habitable habitat for humanity in the universe. So let's look after that first and foremost. But putting it personally, humanity has been incredibly successful. It's an incredibly successful species. And we've overcome all sorts of challenges, not least sanitation, energy, warmth, shelter, modern medicine, which meant that our population has surged. It took us about 300,000 years to hit our first billion, and then it took just 120 years to our second billion. And to put that in perspective, that's when my mum was born in 1927. The third billion was when I was born, and I'm just in my early 60s. And since I was born, our population has more than doubled, and we hit 8 billion last year, the fastest billion we've had in the history of humanity. So we can see that our population, our species, has really come to dominate the earth. And at the same time as our population has, more than doubled in my lifetime, the population of every other species, or wild species, has declined massively. By the latest report from the Worldwide Fund for Nature and the Zoological Society of London was a 69% decline in wild populations over the past 50 years. It would seem to me that report would be better titled the Dying Report, because that's what it records, the loss of the diversity of the species on Earth with which we share this planet. And that impacts upon us, of course. So yeah, population is a huge issue. But as you said in your introduction, Regina, yeah, there are an awful lot of people in some countries, such as India, such as Sub-Saharan Africa, where the population is still really growing, but is not actually growing so fast in the developed world. The imbalance is that those of us who you could say are fortunate to live in the global north, in America and the UK and Europe, our fertility rates are going down as our women and families, men and women have choice over the number of children they have. And in the main, our girls are go into education and have that right, that basic right of education. That isn't the case in the global south. But nevertheless, whilst you can pat ourselves on the back for that, we are the greatest producers of greenhouse gases and have been for centuries. So climate change is our doing to date. It's our responsibility. So if I was actually represented by what I am in terms of per capita consumption in the world, I would be a 10-ton King Kong stomping about the UK countryside, because that's my resource take. So the interesting thing about working on population is people say, oh, you don't like children and you're pointing the finger at people in high fertility countries. You must be some sort of neo-colonialist, fascist, eco-fascist. No, not at all. We have to take on board our responsibility. So if we want to really ease the burden on the planet, for those of us in the rich global north, the developed world, we have to reduce our consumption. We have to reduce our global footprint and shrink down from those 10-ton King Kongs stomping around the place. But at the same time, the tragedy is that, and you've just talked about India taking over from China as the #1 populated continent. Well, yeah, indeed, China and India have until recently had the highest fertility rates and the most burgeoning populations. They are now changing. They're now developing as they should and is their right. But they have now got the fastest growing population of high level consumers in the world. So suddenly it's changed. And why wouldn't they? But if they go down the same route as we have, we are seriously in trouble. And then the sort of extra dimension of that tragedy is that Africa, countries like Nigeria, their populations are burgeoning. Their fertility rate is still really high, and certainly across the Sahel, where it's 5 kids plus. But in those countries, in Africa, actually, the per capita footprint, their individual greenhouse gas contribution has actually gone down, not because they're consuming less, but because it's spread amongst a greater body of people. So individually, they are not responsible for climate change, but as a continent, Africa's global greenhouse footprint has trebled. So you can see there are all these issues that we have to balance and consider. But what we do know is that it is both population growth and consumption, economic development, GDP, that is driving climate change. And that is in all the reports. So if you look at the latest IPCC report, the International Panel on Climate Change, they're absolutely clear. It's a combination of human population growth and consumption. So we have to address both. So yes, it's about our responsibility reducing our consumption. But in terms of addressing population growth, the strange irony for me as a population campaigner and working with colleagues across Africa and India and Latin America is that the solution is really simple, and it's a really positive solution. And you referred to it, Regina. It's a combination of enabling access to family planning, contraceptive choice to the hundreds of millions of women in the world who currently lack it for a whole range of reasons. It's not so much that it isn't necessarily there in the nearest town or village, pharmacy or whatever. There may be religious practices or cultural practices or patriarchal control or nationalistic policies which are not allowing those girls and women their basic human rights of education and, as you put it, autonomy and agency over their own fertility and their own bodies. And that would make a tremendous difference, because that number, they say there's something like 230 million women in the world currently with that unmet need. It's set to rise to 270 million women by the middle of the century, and that's due to population growth. So there are more girls out of school because of population growth. But addressing those two things is not difficult. It would be less than $5 a year per woman to sort out that lack of access to family planning. But the focus just isn't there, partly because politicians don't know how to deal with long-term issues, and many of them don't want to talk about population because they feel there are negative connotations about it, going back to old, outdated, long discredited family planning, not family planning, population control policies, particularly in China and India. And yet there are many more progressive policies run at the grassroots community level which have achieved great things. And Costa Rica is one example of that. They turned around their country, and now it's one of the happiest countries in the world on the happiness index. They've reforested 50% of their land, 80% of their population has access to contraception. So you can see there are real solutions. And just to end finally, it's also a solution for climate change, not least in giving resilience to those women who are no longer burdened with a clutch of children about them. They have access to education, they have access to economic independence, they can react to climate challenges, they can be more resilient, they can adapt, but also it has a tremendous mitigation effect. It would contribute more cuts in greenhouse gas emissions than all onshore and offshore wind power combined. And yet you don't hear any of the environmental NGOs talking about it.
That's so true, Robin. And really, I appreciate your discussing the human rights quotient of this whole matter. The ability for a girl or a woman to get an education, that is a basic human right. That is number 4 on the SDGs. It's incredibly important. And we have to get creative. One of the things that I've noted that India is doing is they are offering money to families who will send their female children to school. I also read that one of the things is when a woman in India has a second girl, that if she stops after that, she will be given a large sum of money, which for us here in the States, what would it be? $250. But for them, it's quite a lot. And this is because, of course, the preference for male children. So there's many things that we can do to be creative, to help fund more positive direction of change. And as you say, also, this is all rightly linked to happiness in terms of one's life. And, there are also many health implications with these many pregnancies. And I'm wondering, Dr. Carter, if that's something that you might want to speak to.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm certainly no expert on population, but I suppose I can call myself an expert on people in the developed world because I've spent my life doctoring and looking after those people. We're in this survival issue now, applies to all of us, right? We've got our emissions increasing as fast as ever. We've got our atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases higher than ever and increasing as fast, if not faster than ever. So the whole of the human population is in a more than a terrible emergency. And life is going to get worse for all of us. And it's starting. Everybody, I think, can see it. I think you mentioned rights. I think rights is very much at the core of this. Women's rights, yes. Children's rights as well, because we all seem to be denying the right to our children in all countries to have a livable future. It's what the IPC 6 assessment says is a livable future. We are all denying that. We are all behaving in a manner in which all of our children are just going to go through a hell of a situation on planet Earth. So a friend of mine here in British Columbia, he worked on a project which he called Child Honoring, which I thought was absolutely brilliant. So I'll mention that because I think that's crucial for us all. But I think, and Robin will know whether this is right much better than I, but I get the impression that in the countries such as Africa, which are still having these high birth rates, there really isn't very much of a thing of women's rights at all. And there certainly seems to be nothing in the way of girls' rights. I gather one of the reasons why Africa continues with this amazing population increase and number of children is that females have their first child when they're extremely young, when they're very, very young. I also get the impression, I'm painting a broad brush here, and obviously there's going to be exceptions, but I think Africa is living under a pretty oppressive patriarchy, from what I can tell, right? We, of course, have terrible stories about the patriarchy in India and the abuse of women, and particularly the abuse of children, and that goes on. So I am, of course, and I worked very hard at family planning, and I'm sure that all of these, if the girls were educated and if the young women in Africa had the same rights and same powers as their husbands and brothers, etc. Number one, that would be, I think, a very good thing for all of them and all of us. Yeah, I agree with Robin, certainly. Some years ago, the main driver of greenhouse gas emissions was regarded to pretty well be GDP, But now it's true, there's a mix now. It's being driven by population as well as GDP. And the last assessment pointed out that we would not control our emissions and we would not achieve anything like a livable climate if we continued with the population growth that we have in the world right now, if I can put it like that. So yeah, they did say that, and they did, of course, point out that the Oxfam, the great work that Oxfam's done, that roughly speaking, about 10% of the population are responsible for 50% of the emissions, and then 50% of the bottom 50% of the population responsible for something like less than 10% of emissions. You mentioned happiness. I think we really need to work together as one human family. We need to help each other everywhere with regards to achieving the best kind of security that we can in the world that we have already now created, which is not a very good world at all when I compare it to the world that I was born into.
Thank you, Peter, for sharing your thoughts. And those of you who are watching this, if you are learning something, please make sure to give us an upvote and share this video. Paul, do you have any questions or thoughts that you would like to direct to our guest today?
Yes, there'll be some questions within. I'll also talk about some of my ideas and thoughts on population. So it's one of the best failures of the human ability to understand exponential growth, right? Because we don't really understand it that well. We tend to be linear thinkers. I love the example of exponential growth where bulrushes or weeds covering a pond are doubling in area each day. The whole pond is covered after 30 days. How many days for it to be half covered? And the answer, of course, is 29. Population growth is exponential, and it can creep up on people. They're just amazed at how quickly it grows as you get higher and higher numbers. And you gave a perfect example, Robin, by talking about 300,000 years for the first billion, 120 for the second, and so on up to where we are is 8 billion. Regina, I loved your example of the dinner party for 10 people, and if 20 show up or 100 show up, just to inject a little bit of humor, I would just call skip the dishes or Uber Eats. But we need something like that for the planet, obviously. I mean, part of population growth causing stress is the access to enough food, the access to enough clean water, and so on, because those supplies are never growing exponentially. Those are growing, at much slower rate. We can have so-called green revolution where we use, we can increase yields greatly, but yields have kind of tapered off, and extreme weather events that either make it too dry in places to grow food or flood out other regions so we can't grow food. Those are very serious issues. I think climate change and the stresses from population and all these other factors are really threatening our global food supply more than anything else. The idea of child honoring programs, which Peter mentioned, it comes into honoring children, but also honoring, women's rights, girls' rights. Those things are crucial because, educated women, they know the options. This has traditionally been a problem in our society, in our patriarchal society. I have to put some blame on economists because the economists, they love GDP growth. And one of the big things that causes GDP to grow is for population to grow because there's more people consuming, more people buying. We need metrics that are reflecting much more than GDP, quality of life, happiness indexes. People are working on different things because ask yourself the moral question. We know that this population growth is not sustainable. Nothing exponential is forever. So are we going to just let it continue until there's a crash? We know there'll be a crash in population when we hit the hard limits of nature, what the earth can provide, etc. And many, many people are going to suffer. It seems much more ethical to me to have everybody talking about population growth in terms of what can we do to level it, to maintain a population that can thrive on this planet, and not at the expense of nature, not at the expense of the population of, wild animals. The horrifying statistic is there's more chickens in the world, for example, than every bird species combined. So there's no easy solutions, but we need to talk about this. The population being the elephant in the room isn't acceptable anymore. And in closing, maybe I've seen some books published already about saying that population growth is a good thing, trying to encourage more population growth. I'm talking about in developed countries. Some countries are dealing with it, their own population, by immigration. So Canada wants to increase immigration to 500,000 people per year, up from the present 350, closing almost 400. Otherwise, our population would be declining in Canada. There's books saying that what's more important than population is the age distribution of populations, that curve. Because if you have too many younger males, for example, you're much more likely to have wars, etc. And also, as there's more and more old people retiring, if the population's not, you don't have enough workers in a country, then your social services can collapse. So there's all of these issues. And anyway, thank you very much, Robin, for letting us know what you and your organization do and some of the complex challenges that are there in it.
Thank you, Paul. Robin, I have a question that hasn't been brought up yet, and I think it's really important that we talk about it. And that is this whole concept when we bring up this idea of population, colonialism, imperialism, racism. How do we counter that?
Well, the key thing is to give voice and space to those who are in the front line of population growth and have the greatest legitimacy to talk about this issue. So Heidi and Charles and I met at the UN Conference on Water recently, but there's just been a follow-up conference on population this last week. And my colleague Florence, who is a Ugandan by birth, was our representative there. And she has very relevant lived experience. She comes from a family of, I think, 12 siblings. And she saw what was happening in her country in terms of when she first went back to Uganda with her husband, he couldn't believe how many babies were there. She went on a marvelous journey where she got into education, she got to college, she became a TV reporter, she reported in Uganda on these issues, particularly on women's rights, girls' rights. And Peter, you mentioned about the patriarchy. I think the figure that I saw recently was that 40% of girls in less developed countries are married and giving birth from the age of sort of 18. And you're absolutely right. If mums are really young, they're not going into other activities, they stay being fertile and giving birth for a longer period of time. And so that does really sort of drive population growth. So there are some simple rights to try and, so the universal right for secondary education for all girls is something everybody should be calling for. Currently we're amazingly working in Afghanistan with a small grassroots charity, which is working under the eye of the Taliban to enable women some choice over family planning, as well as looking after them as they are in their first sort of pregnancy. So there are some very challenging places. And of course, Malala was shot in the head in the Swat Valley in Pakistan for having the temerity to wish for an education. So there's some dark forces we have to overcome, but they're not just in those parts of the world. Of course, we've seen the overturning of Roe v. Wade in the US. In Poland, we see some pretty pro-natalist, nationalistic agendas where women and girls' rights are being restricted. It's laughable, they have their sex education in schools is actually got nothing to do with sex. It's to do all with traditional family values. And the curriculum is written by a bunch of celibate men from the sort of Orthodox Catholic Church. So there are, all across the world are sprinkled these negative clusters of old-fashioned patriarchal values. But thankfully, not all men are terrible, and there are good men and good boys out there. We also work with a great group in Kenya called Dandelion Africa, and they set up an initiative from teenage boys, young men in rural Kenya, called Boys for Change. And they worked because they did not want to see their sisters suffering as their mothers and aunts had. They did not want to see their sisters having FGM, female genital mutilation. They wanted their sisters to have choice and options, and they stopped FGM in the 3 villages they worked in, and that's not happened for 5 years now. So there are some really positive movements, I think. I mean, there's so much you've all said that we could have several programs on this, which is fantastic. But I think the colonialism one, Regina, is a really interesting one, because I went to COP26 up in Glasgow. We pretty soon discovered that the population word was sort of, we don't talk about that. And the only meeting I attended, which was a breath of fresh air, was chaired by a wonderful colleague called Dr. Elia Zulu, who works for an African development body based in Kenya. He's a Malawian by birth. Next door to him was the Minister of State for Forestry and Environment in Malawi. And they had a speaker from the Philippines who works on women's rights as well. A great panel. None of them were white Europeans or white US North Americans. And Elia opened his statement by sort of chuckling. He opened the meeting, which he was chairing, by saying, it's funny, but at this COP and all the others, it's like the P word, as I call it, has been banned. And by that, I mean population. And you felt the sort of relief in the room that we could talk about this. And of course, this was people in the front line. And the Minister for the Environment from Malawi, Nancy Tembo, said, we have to talk about population, because without it, we will not be able to enable our children to live that wonderful future that should be available to everybody. And we will not protect our environment, and our ecosystems will collapse. But elsewhere, it was banned. And I was told to my face in a public meeting that I was coming from a white supremacist, neo-colonialist, eco-fascist framing, because I suggested there was a secondary benefit from educating girls and enabling family planning to the environment and to climate change. It's all there in the evidence. It's all there in the IPCC report. But amongst certain NGOs, it's sort of haram to talk about it, which is ridiculous, because our partners and friends in Africa and India and Latin America and Costa Rica, they will talk about it. They want those choices and rights. So we should be able to marry those together, if that's not an inappropriate analogy. So we have to overcome sort of silencing discourses and taboos, which are particularly, I think, permeated and contaminated the global north NGOs out of an understandable guilt from our overconsumption, our colonial past. But, we had a gathering in Kenya last year in Kilifi, which we call the Population Conversation. I was the only non-African present. I was one of 3 white people present. Everyone else of the 40 gathered were Black Africans from Kenya, Malawi, Rwanda, Uganda. And we could talk about population. And they sort of laughed in a wonderfully charming way at me for being overly precious about talking about it. Said, no, come on, let's just, we need to talk about the reality. The reality is that our environment is suffering. Our women and girls do not have the rights and choices they should have. And we are not going to be able to sustain a peaceful environment unless we address this issue. And when you look at the projections for Sub-Saharan Africa and the Sahel, not just in population growth, but temperature rise, we are facing, I think, a really challenging future. And the danger, as I keep trying to point out to my lovely progressive liberal friends at Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace and elsewhere, is if you don't address this issue, you are going to see hundreds of millions of people trying to move north into Southern Europe or south into Sub-Saharan Africa. And the disruption and the chaos is going to be like nothing we're seeing at the moment, with people rightfully trying to seek a better life. And you will see not lovely progressive liberal groups like you in charge. You will see fascist, nationalistic, Trumpian wall building regimes across the Mediterranean. So it's like, come on, we have to act now. And the technology is in our hands. I regard contraception as the finest technology that humanity has invented. And it's a modern progressive technology. And we will not solve our issues that the world is facing unless we enable that technology being accessed by all who wish to use it in the world.
Thank you, Robin. You touched on some of my favorite subjects, including eco-migration. And with that, unfortunately, geopolitical destabilization. But I also really appreciate the point you made about the boys getting involved and the males getting involved, because let's face it, who is listened to? Who matters? Whose opinions matter more? It's not the girls and the women's, it's the males. We need the males to get involved and to stand up for the rights of females, because if females could do it on our own, we would have done it. Doesn't work with just women fighting for our rights. We need men who care. So it's all very important. If you've enjoyed the high quality guests that we've had on our show so far today, please remember to subscribe. We don't want you to miss any episode of the Climate Emergency Forum.
The other right, of course, I would mention, is it's been inferred, is the right to adequate food and the right to safe drinkable water. And that is a universal right. They are universal rights, and they're not being respected at all. So I really appreciate Robin's history and his stories. I really enjoyed them. You and your friends are doing great work. I can definitely see your point of view. trying to get along with our NGOs. Yeah, I can relate to that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I really like what you said about honoring children. We've I was on the phone on a Zoom to them yesterday. We commissioned a leading pediatrician, a really internationally respected pediatrician, and some of his colleagues to do a report looking at how addressing population is the most honoring thing you can do for future generations of children, because you will, at the moment, as you say, they're heading for a ghastly and uncertain future, which is a phrase from another group of Australian researchers who are actually involved in this report in terms of the existential threat. But if you want to reduce childhood mortality, if you want to improve the future, livelihoods and well-being of children to come, the best thing you can do is to enable our population to stabilize and reduce. And it's all possible. If you look at the UN projections, it's all there. It's just we have to keep doing what we're doing and more, rather like at the UN Water Conference, where they rather alarmingly said they needed a 4-fold increase in progress, which I don't think there's much chance of that given where they are at the moment. None of the SDGs are going to be achieved because of where we're at, and population growth is a factor of that. So like education, well, there's 130 million more girls out of school because of population growth. Renewable energy in India has been undermined by population growth. It's like 30% of it has been eroded because of the increase in population. So it's the filling up the bath with the plug hole out sort of thing, with the plug out. So yeah, we have to think of ways of getting these messages across, and that's why I have 2 girls. I've got 2 daughters. I don't hate children. I love children, but I have to think about my responsibilities as a consumer. But I also think, well, what's their future? What have I done? I'm a population concern environmentalist. What have I done having children? Well, I have done that. I've made that counterintuitive decision. So now I have to live with it. And I now have to, as all of us have to think about, how are we going to enable honor the next generation?
I mean, honoring the next generation is crucial. Like the child honoring program for today's children is very important, but we need to value human life in the future. And economists talk about a discount rate. It was in the Stern report. We're behaving as if there's no value for future generations. It's everything now. I mean, we're acting exactly as we would if we don't give any value to people that haven't been born yet in the future.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone today, and a very big thank you to our special guests, Robert and Maynard, and not just for showing up and sharing your thoughts and experience with us on our show today, but for all that you've done. I mean, your life spans and just a wide range of many, many things that are really of great benefit to humankind. And so we thank you so much for that as well. I want to thank all of you who have stayed with us through to the end of this show. I think it's a very important topic, and I hope that you do as well. And I would like to know what your thoughts are. Do you share the idea that population does matter for keeping our planet safe, clean for the future of the youth? Do you think it's an extreme measure, as some people do? So please let us know. We really do care what you have to say, and we read over your comments. So thank you once again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time at the Climate Emergency Forum.